Hi everyone! Welcome to the very first live webinar of the Authy webinar series. Thanks for joining us today for Buy versus Build, how SendGrid implemented 2FA using Authy. I'm Séverine, the marketing manager at Authy. During this webinar, we really would like to hear from you and to include your voice in the conversation. So please ask questions, share comments, even challenge our ideas. Use the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen to share at any time during the session, and we'll dedicate 10 minutes to answer your questions at the end. Now, I want to introduce our featured speakers. Simon Thorpe is Director of Product at Authy. Simon manages the engineering team. And our guest speaker, Jensen, is Senior Product Manager at SendGrid. Jensen is in charge of the Authy integration. Well, Simon, let's get started.
Smashing. Thank you very much, Severin. I really appreciate that introduction. So welcome, Jensen. Thanks for joining us today on this webinar. And before we actually go into detail and talk to Jensen about how SendGrid have increased security around their application accounts, I just wanted to quickly go over a few pieces of information about what the topic is we're talking about today. And when we talk about two-factor authentication, the differences between buying something or actually building it into an application from scratch, what that means. So if we look at what's happening in the market, and if you look at the press, we're seeing every single day another report of some service online being attacked and being hacked and data being breached. And the sorts of services we're seeing leaking this information, they're not small companies, they're large companies with lots of people, big security teams and big development teams. So that just proves that we are constantly dealing with this threat and this challenge of securing the type of data that's very sensitive inside our applications. And there's a lot of reports that are floating out there, but there's a great one from a company called Risk-Based Security. 2015 were collecting submissions from users, and they were searching the internet, searching the press and the media, and they found that there was nearly 4,000 incidents in 2015 that resulted in a data loss of some form. And they collected all of those together and found there was about 736 million records of users that were being lost. And if we look at that in a little bit more detail, again, this is from the same report, and looking at the type of data that was actually being leaked, the vast majority of information was about the user login. So it was passwords, top of the list clearly, but then email and username right behind. So this is the type of information that's being leaked from all these data breaches. And why is that significant? Well, unfortunately, if we look at another piece of research that happened over the past couple of years, passwords are still very poorly used mechanisms to authenticate to websites. So this is the top 5 passwords that were found in all these data dumps that people are putting onto the Tor networks and other websites. And also the company that did this research was talking to companies who are analyzing their own password data of internal employees. And again, they aggregated all of this up. And unfortunately, passwords that people are still choosing today are very, very poor. So if you think about millions of records being leaked onto the internet with usernames and passwords, and those passwords being used are very poorly selected, it doesn't take it too far that it's very easy for people to get access to your account if you're included in some of that information. However, there are ways to improve security of just a regular username and password to your application. And these technologies have been around for a while. And what we talk about when we try to increase the username and password used as part of authentication, we talk about these as factors. So a factor is something that you know. So a username and password is something that you know. And the problem with factors that you know is they can be easily shared. And once you share it verbally, or it's lost, or it's stolen from a website, you essentially either have to change it or use something different. So it's very difficult to kind of protect against something you know. And this is why people choose simple passwords, because if you do have to change it, trying to create something that you can remember is very, very difficult. So there are other factors we can use in the authentication process. For example, something that you have. So back in the 1980s, a company called RSA used their encryption algorithm to create a unique passcode that allowed you to log in after you use something like username and password. And because you have this little device in your pocket that's generating this token, this number, you use that as part of the authentication process. So if somebody does steal your username and password, they can't get into your account because they need to have access to the thing that's in your pocket. And many of you might be familiar with also physical security using something you have, like your pass card that you use to get into the office at work. And we also have a third mechanism here, another factor, which is something you are. And this is often used or the term here is biometrics. And whilst there are very expensive eye scanners, etc., that have been in the industry for a long time, we're seeing biometrics finally get ubiquitous functionality in front of end users, such as Apple's Touch ID, where they can use their thumbprint on their phone to unlock their phone. So these are the sort of three main areas of factors that have been used to mitigate the problems with the username and password. And actually, if you look at how these really get used, there are some very common ones. So as I said, hardware tokens are still in use today. The downside of a token is it's something that you have to have. It's something else that you need to keep in your pocket. And if you have access to multiple systems that use this type of token, you need multiple pieces of hardware in your pocket, which is why we actually transitioned away from that for a lot of users to something like SMS. So this is a great use case of why Authy, this product, is built on Twilio, because we send a lot of SMS messages out as part of the authentication process. So you log in with your username and password, then you send the token out via an SMS. But now we're using phones. These phones have a lot more capabilities than they did 20, 30 years ago. Now we can run the same software that was running on that little piece of hardware actually on your phone with an application. And here you can see the code being generated. Now all these mechanisms so far are all about sending a separate piece of information to something that you have in your pocket, your phone, as part of your authentication process. So if somebody does have your username and password, they need to either get access to the phone that receives the SMS or access to the phone that has the app running that generates that token. But in more recent months, we've actually evolved the whole mechanisms further, and we now have something which we call push authentication. And this is by far the best way to do it, which is your device gets a push notification, just like you get a notification about somebody posting to Facebook or a tweet. And when you click on that notification, it fires up our software, which tells you a lot more about what's going on. Someone is trying to log into a website. Is it you? Yes or no? So these are the common factors we have today. And big question about this for many of you on the line that are in charge of applications is, great, I want to increase the security of my accounts. I want to do it with more factual authentication. How do I do it? So if we start with your application environment, obviously you have a login process. You have a user profile where somebody manages their second factor authentication. So for instance, providing a phone number, providing an email address, which is part of that second factor, or registering hardware devices if you're using hardware devices. And then finally, you want control over the 2FA process itself, because after login and what you do next, you want to make sure that's critically embedded into your application. So those things you do want to own. However, when you start building this functionality out, let's say you start with the most modern version, which is push-based notification. You now need to figure out, how do I push that notification down to the device? So you need to integrate with the common push networks from Google and Apple. And then you've got to write software, the phone, to get that communication down to it. And then when somebody gets a notification on the phone they have to respond to, how do you notify your application? So that has to come back via a callback to your application. So this is great. It doesn't look like a great deal of work. But the problem is a lot of people don't necessarily have network connectivity. They may not have a smartphone. They may only have a feature phone which has SMS in it. You have to provide fallback features for your end users, otherwise you're making it very difficult to use. So then you have to figure out, okay, so I can't use push notification. I need what we call one-time password logic. I need to generate a password specific for that user, and I need to send it to them not via the website, but via another channel, which is often either a voice connection, the system calls you up and speaks the number to you, or via an SMS. Now you have to build a gateway to integrate with different vendors to send those SMSs or create those voice connections. And now you can see the software involved, the effort, the maintenance, the security around this is starting to increase inside your application. And you've got to monitor it, you've got to make sure it's up to date. And as I said, over the past 6 to 12 months, a lot in the industry have been moving very quickly with newer methods and newer factors. You would need to build that into your application if you built this all yourself. So this is what Authy is all about, and this is the product that I work with and that Jensen, who's going to talk to us in a second, has integrated into SendGrid. And what we've done is we've taken all of that back-end logic and integrated it into a cloud service. So if you look at the parts that you need to have control over, so absolutely, you need to have total control over your login process, the user profile, and actually the 2FA process itself from a design perspective. How does it look in your application? What's the logic around it? What's the decision making? But all the back-end communication we've built into our cloud service, and we've also built all of the apps and an SDK that allows you to embed all that functionality in your own existing mobile applications. So this is the value of what we're doing. And if you look at sort of the burden of it, we're taking away from you all the monitoring, the security testing, the maintenance, and we even support the end users who are signing up for 2FA. For example, the greatest problem is what happens if somebody loses their phone and the 2FA was tied to their phone. So now they can't log into their website because they may know their username and password, but now they're not getting the text that they rely on to be able to provide that second factor. So how do they go through a well-qualified and secure process for legitimately changing their phone number? That's something you don't want to handle. We have a lot of experience in doing that for you. So finally, before we get on to talking to Jensen, just to say that this cloud service, not only is it abstracted from your application, but we've made it very easy to deploy. Quite literally, you're adding 3 extra calls into your service. You're registering users with us so that we know about their phone number and whatever applications they're using. Then at the time of login, you're generating some form of request with us so that we can then communicate with the end user with that secondary factor. And then once they've responded, you need to verify that response to make sure that they're doing it securely. It's as simple as that. So enough of me talking about how our product is relatively easy to use. It's much better coming from somebody who has actually used it. So Jensen, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm really pleased that you're able to join us today. So Jensen works at SendGrid. I just want to quickly ask you a few questions over the next 20 minutes about how you used Authy within your application. But before we do that, tell us about your company and what you do for SendGrid.
Sure, absolutely. So I am the senior product manager for SendGrid. I basically take care of any of the customer touch points that aren't a part of our marketing application. So, but basically what SendGrid does is, because of the history of spam and phish and all of these other things that make email for consumers really kind of annoying, companies like Gmail and Yahoo have implemented these really strict security policies around what they allow into their inbox. So for developers, that's actually a really hard problem, because when their code sends a message directly to someone at Gmail or Yahoo or someone like that, a lot of times that message gets dropped because that application assumes that it's spam or phish or some type of malicious content or something like that. So what SendGrid does is it takes all of that burden off of the developer and allows them to call SendGrid's API, and we ensure that that message gets into the inbox, and especially for really important emails like forgot password emails or receipts or something like that, things that are absolutely necessary to get into the inbox for your users. SendGrid kind of abstracts that logic and takes that developer burden away from the developer and puts it into our hands.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jensen. Sorry, there's a little delay between me coming off mute and not being able to talk over top of you, so I apologize about that.
Sure.
So let's look at SendGrid itself. I mean, why did you? I've just gone through 5 minutes of explaining why I think people need to be adding better security to their sites and using 2 factors or more factor authentication to be able to protect that. What was your specific reason? Why did SendGrid look at 2FA, and what drove you to adding this service?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, SendGrid early on built their own 2-factor authentication method that just directly integrated with Twilio, and we did exactly what you were describing, where we generated our own code and sent it off to Twilio, and reacted after that. And our application has grown really quickly. Our interface has grown and changed really quickly, and the needs of our customers has grown and changed really quickly. So we added a bunch of features that required us to go back to that 2-factor auth and really reevaluate how it was working from a user experience perspective, especially as we kind of changed our user model, added additional, so that you could invite additional people to your account, things like that. And that was going to require us to basically rewrite from scratch our 2-factor authentication method. And that means, overhauling database, overhauling the entire implementation from end to end. And so what we did when we looked at that was say, like, is this really worth it? Is the cost of redoing that implementation worth the value that we get out of two-factor authentication. Now, we knew that we needed some type of two-factor authentication, but we didn't want to have to rewrite this, and then when the needs of our users change in a year or 2 years, rewrite it again.
Yeah.
So,
and just out of interest, Jensen, what was the implementation you had initially? So it sounds so you built your own 2FA initially. Was it just SMS, or were you doing generation of Google Authenticator compliant QR codes, etc.?
It was just SMS, and that posed actually a big problem for some of our users who wanted to do things like access SendGrid from an airplane or access SendGrid from outside the country, but when they didn't have cellular network connectivity. So that was another thing. That was another problem that our users were having with just direct SMS two-factor authentication. So we knew that we had to solve that problem when we were looking at rebuilding this. So we were really weighing, again, building it ourselves with kind of a Google Authenticator or, some type of open source project and looking at Authy and things like that, and eventually decided on Authy. Right.
Okay. All right. And so that actually leads nicely into sort of the next question. You had an existing 2FA solution. It was just SMS, so it lacked a lot of other features. It sounds like you had customers saying, I want to do this, I can't access SendGrid here and there, etc. I think planes is a really good example in that the technology to access via a flight now is incredible, except now I've got my laptop which has Wi-Fi, and I have to pay double for my phone to have Wi-Fi on a plane. So clearly you want to be able to, all these modern ways of communicating with phones for two-factor authentication. It's a really good example that even generating that offline token and having an offline 2FA solution is really important, even when you've got the sort of more modern environment where I'm sat on a plane accessing Wi-Fi. So leading from that into Authy itself, when you started looking at Authy, what was the and obviously because you built it yourself, you had a really good insight as to what you were looking for. What about our service was really valuable to you making the decision to move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things there was, if we just look at SendGrid's model and what we add to developers' experience, we take the expertise and the necessity to educate yourself on email out of the developer's hands, and they just hand the email to us and we make sure it gets delivered. So we take a lot of that burden off the developer. And so it just made sense when we were looking at a two-factor authentication service to think about the same thing. We're not experts in two-factor authentication. So we're not going to keep up to date on the newest technologies. We're not going to continually research what best practices are. We're going to implement this, and we're going to forget it. And so when we run into a problem later on, like we did, when we were before we started looking at Authy, we're going to have to go back and redo this whole thing again. And so one of the most valuable things about Authy was, when we were looking at it, actually they had just recently released this push notification feature, and so we knew that they were going to continually keep that application up to date and continually release according to the newest technology. And you talked about biometrics, like that was all very interesting to us. And all we would have to do in order to update our application is call a few new APIs, maybe add a slightly different front end for a user experience, but we could keep this up to date with very minimal investment on our side, and without having to, have a developer spend their time researching and becoming an expert in this area. We could just abstract that totally to Authy.
So it's not a particular feature. I think what you're saying is it's more the fact that we just build the entire service for you. It's not like that particular SMS feature is the difference, but it's that you don't have to worry about a lot of the aggregation of these features and how they're delivered, as long as somebody else are more of an expert. I think this is kind of what we're seeing in the industry around the API economy, where we ourselves, we use Twilio for our SMS. So we're not experts in SMS connectivity, they are. And actually, we use email providers like SendGrid. I mean, SendGrid is a customer of Twilio. And I don't need to be an expert in how to send email because I just call your API and I send an email. So it sounds like that of all the different features that we could sit down and analyze and look at and understand, really the great value is here is not having to deal with any of it at all and just call a simple API to be able to get that functionality as a total.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I'm a product manager, so I'm looking at cost, opportunity cost, missed opportunities. If we spend our time working on two-factor authentication, what value are our customers not getting because we spent that time? So when I was really evaluating whether or not we should build this ourselves or integrate with someone else, I had to look at, all right, what's going to be the cost of maintaining this for a developer, of building this, of becoming experts in this service versus just integrating, and what's the future cost of that going to be? And there was a dramatic difference when we looked at integrating by saying, you know what, we're just not even going to worry about it. We're going to do what we do best, and we're going to abstract the other things to other companies. So you're absolutely right. It was more about you being an expert.
Was that easy to do? Because often when I'm a product owner in a similar fashion to you, and I'm often having a look at functionality we want to build into our service, and it's weird because we're selling a product where we're telling people, don't build it yourself, use our API, and yet often we make internal decisions where we're looking at building functionality, and we still have that same challenge of, do we build something like this, or do we just go and buy a service? And the cost is sometimes a difficult thing to quantify. How easy was it for you to look at projecting how much Authy was going to cost your business as a whole versus the figuring out labor costs and maintenance costs and all the other things that would come if you built it yourself? Was that a challenge, or did you find that relatively easy to argue to your managers?
Well, in general, that is a huge challenge for product managers. I would say that that's nearly impossible in most cases. But we were lucky in the sense that we had already developed a two-factor auth version. So I had metrics to go back to say, all right, how much time have we spent maintaining this code base? How much time have we spent integrating with new authentication methods? Because in the meantime, we had integrated SAML and SSO, which are just kind of ubiquitous authentication methods. So how much time did we have to spend altering this two-factor authentication method to work with those two things? Like, I could go back to a history and look at how much time and cost we had spent, developer costs, we had spent in maintaining our current code base, and how much time were we going to spend rewriting, just looking back at how long it took us to write the first instance. So I had this history to go back to and look at. So that problem was much easier. If I didn't have that, it's like a universal problem for product managers to try to quantify those things. But luckily I had this. But you had
the luxury of already have done this. You'd already, I don't want to use this particular language, but you kind of already gone down the wrong path in the sense that you tried to build, well, actually that's too difficult. Let's try and find another way to do this. And I often look at these as security is definitely something you don't want to build yourselves. I mean, if we were on the call here talking about encrypting data and I was trying to argue, don't write your own encryption algorithm. That's not a good idea. I think, and most people in the internet today who have any awareness of security would instantly agree with us. But I think you need to abstract that argument to anything about security. Building it yourself, not only is it costly, but the actual risks inherent with getting that wrong. I mean, if you were to build your own 2FA solution and somehow introduce a loophole which allowed you to bypass it, you're actually weakening your security rather than improving it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that was part of the maintenance cost that we looked at as well. Like you have to stay up on all of these different, security holes in the implementation you might have used or something like that. It becomes costly, especially around security.
Right. So just moving on to my next question here, and this is more sort of looking into the technical details. I'm assuming that we have some people on the call that would be very interested in the bits and bytes. Sort of take yourself back to the day where you first created your Authy account and went through the trial process. What was it like implementing Authy? What challenges did you have? What would you have done different? And what things were you surprised by that were, relatively easy to do?
Sure, absolutely. So I think for kind of a very general user model in a very, straightforward implementation of Authy, it's very easy. You call a couple APIs, you get a response, you react, right? It's not Authy even takes care of the rate limiting so that you can't be brute forced and things like that. So like it was very easy to do, but unfortunately our user model is very complicated. So we have users and they can have other usernames and passwords that they kind of dole out to their teammates, and you know, that sounds like it's just kind of a general thing, but the way it's implemented on our side, it becomes a little bit more complicated, and that's a different technical conversation. But we had to kind of conform Authy's APIs to work with our user model. It took a little bit of research, but you know, the APIs themselves are flexible enough to where we could make that work. And you know, the only thing on our side is if a user has two different usernames and passwords on SendGrid, they'll actually have the same authentication token on the Authy app for both of those. And that's because Authy just looks at the device ID in order to determine whether or not they have a token already or not. So that's, I mean, that was a little bit of a...
Was that a benefit to you?
It turned out to be confusing at first, but it is a benefit because when you go in to the Authy application, it's very easy to pick out which token you need to log in because there's just one token. If there was two, it would actually be a little bit more confusing. So at first it was, we had a hard time understanding kind of why another token was not being generated, but it took, you know, about 5 minutes to understand, oh, that they're just using the device ID. You can use the same token to log into both accounts. So those are the only like little gotchas. But, you know, in overall implementation, it really is very simple.
And so without trying to ask you to expose too much of your underlying infrastructure, which in itself is obviously, you know, private information, but were you writing directly against their APIs, or did you actually use a helper library? We have a bunch of helper libraries on GitHub which just make your job a little bit simpler.
So I believe that we integrated just directly with your APIs. Our infrastructure is written in a language called Backbone, so everything on our side is driven by a set of APIs. The front end is just basically a very simple UI. It's almost, you can think of it almost as like static UI, and it just fires off APIs. So, you know, we're very familiar with integrating with APIs because that's basically what our entire front end does. So we just did that against your application.
Gotcha. And so now having gone through the process of deploying this and having this ready, for anybody on the webcast that's listening who is a developer who's sat there thinking, I want to go off and do this, you've got actually great experience. Not only have you built it yourself, but you've also used a service like us. What advice would you give to somebody listening?
I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give is not necessarily for a developer. It's more for just the company as a whole. One of the things that's difficult for us is we don't have a general security policy. So I would say you want to get that. You want to think about whether or not you want to do things like authentication tokens, or basically like Dropbox does, where they give you a token just in case you, let's say, lose your phone, or you know your Authy app doesn't download or something. I don't know how you could lock yourself out of Authy, but you know, I'm sure it's some way you could if you really tried. So if you come up with that solution first, how your company is going to react to those sets of problems, it's much easier later on to be like, all right, you know, if a customer gets locked out, we've given them this extra code to log in that scenario, and then we're not going to help them after that. That's what these larger companies do, Dropbox and things like that. If they lock themselves out, you can't get access to the account unless you have that extra token. So I would just say to be mindful of that process first, and then start to develop two-factor authentication.
Right.
That was mostly where we ran into trouble.
So I think you're saying is design the user flows, try and be an end user, think about the things where you might run into problems before you actually think, I know how this works, I'm going to implement the bits and bytes of putting 2FA in front of the user. I think that's what you're describing.
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely true. And I mean, you also want to think about how your company is going to react to, user locking themselves out or something like that. Because again, social engineering is a threat as well. So you have to think about how you're going to react in those scenarios. But I think those
Right.
they're such tiny use cases that you don't necessarily think about that before you implement something. And then right when you're about to release, you take this to the more the business side of the house or your support organization or something, and they immediately ask those questions. So that's all I'd say. Is the challenge.
After you've launched and gone into production.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're in production now. The support guys go, so how do we do this? How do we support this? Now they've got users calling in saying, I can't log in. So it's actually you've uncovered a question that I hadn't pre-thought of. But one difference that we have in our service, and I don't know, it'd be interesting to know how aware you are. But and I had a customer in the office yesterday who had this exact problem, and I kind of explained to him how Authy worked. And this was a customer that deployed years and years ago with us and just hadn't kept up to date with our changes. But when you register a user with Authy, we highly recommend that you do everything possible to explain to that end user that A, they can download our applications. So if you go to the Apple or Google store and look for Authy, you can install our pre-built application. We actually have an SDK, so if you've got your own mobile app, you could embed that in there. But then also tell them to install it on more than one machine. So most people, when they enable 2FA, they're going to use their phone because it's about the factors that you have. A phone is something that you have. But if now you can't log in, and the security is fantastic because nobody can log in because you've lost your phone. But with Authy, if you install the app on your phone and then install the app maybe on your iPad, or even better, on something like Chrome. So we have a Chrome application which runs on your desktops, that runs on OS X or Windows or any platform you can run Chrome on. And so now you have a second app running somewhere. So if I do happen to lose my phone, I could just go into Chrome and I still have the ability to log in. And we do a lot of work with companies all around the world. So in the US, when you lose your phone or your phone's stolen, getting another phone with exactly the same phone number, that process is pretty easy. But in some sort of other countries, especially developing countries, trying to get access to the same phone number once you've lost your phone can often be very, very difficult. So you want to be able to change the phone number yourself to say, hey, look, I've lost my phone, here's my new phone number. And I mentioned earlier that we actually have a support process. You can send your users to us and we'll go through and we'll manage them changing their phone number. But really, that's clunky. Really, we don't want people talking to our support people. The best thing to do is install the software on more than one device. So if you lose your phone, you can log into Chrome and basically change your phone number directly from Chrome. So when you do get the new phone and you install Authy, you have the ability to restore your tokens and restore access to your service. So that's I never really thought about the impact of that until you described the best thing to do is make sure you have a good recovery model and recovery processes in mind. And actually that's where, we go back to an earlier question of why do you think using Authy is useful? And it's really less about, hey, well, you have a great SMS connectivity or you've got a really nice looking app. Really, the value is not in that. It's in you've designed a system so that if one of my users loses his phone, there's a high percentage chance that he can recover without even calling my help desk. And when you talk about cost, help desk calls are actually really expensive. So you don't want to deploy 2FA, then suddenly find your help desk lit up with thousands of calls. That's a lot of money that you have to then spend defending that. And especially if you've built it yourself, and as you said, you've launched a service without thinking about that recovery. Now you've got to re-engineer your platform to suddenly realize, well, I never thought what would happen if somebody loses their phone.
Yeah, absolutely.
So coming on to more what you've done, when is this actually going to be available? So if there's anybody on the phone now that's a SendGrid user saying, well, clearly I'm going to go switch this on to protect my SendGrid account, when's this going to be out there in the wild so everybody can start protecting their accounts with SendGrid?
Yeah, absolutely. So for now, our old implementation of Two-Factor Auth is live for all of our customers. The new version is in closed beta, available to some users, and that's just our release process. And we're exiting that, and it will be released within the next 1 to 2 weeks. So it will be widely available to all SendGrid users very soon.
Cool, excellent. And I will be walking around the office of Twilio to the guys that use it here to make sure they have it set up as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So finally, the last question I have for you, and this is kind of more not specifically about us. I mean, I'm always looking for feedback from customers and the industry in general. And anybody on the webinar, by the way, I'd love to hear your questions. So you've heard me and Jensen sort of chit-chatting about how they've deployed it. In a few moments, I'm going to go through. I've got a few questions here in front of me. If you've got any questions, just hit the Q&A button there on the webinar interface and pipe those in, and we'll get to those in a second. But Jensen, looking at Authy and also in general from security, what are you looking for next? What's the thing that you think is going to really change the game here? I mean, you mentioned earlier that our push notification authentication service is that something you've deployed yet? Are you looking at deploying it? Is there something about that you would like to see changed, improved, or enhanced?
So for us, when we initially started the conversation with Authy, one of the most exciting things for us was they were thinking about how to do authentication over APIs. So not necessarily locking users out of the front end of the website, but authenticating that, yes, this device is able to call this API. That was one of the most exciting things for us. And even, that is, I think, it's just exciting to hear that Authy is thinking about this kind of universal problem for API customers and thinking about how they could integrate to solve that problem. That was, I think, if anything, you could do the same type of two-factor authentication or device authentication against an API user. That would be amazing.
Okay, yeah, that sounds very interesting. Okay, all right. So let's move on to our Q&A here. We have a few questions that we've got. Let me just have a quick look at these. So I've got one question here from somebody who built an enterprise application inside his own company, but it's actually hosted in their on-premises data center. And so the question is, can they use Authy as a cloud service, even though their application itself is not a cloud service? So that's absolutely yes. I mean, the only requirement here is you can fully integrate Authy with any application, either on-premises in the cloud. You just have to be able to have network connectivity to be able to talk to it. So if you have an on-premises data center that's cut off from the internet and there's no network route at all, then there's no way you can communicate with Authy to start an authentication process and then validate it. But absolutely, if you've got an application that you've built for your own enterprise environment, it's running in your data center, as long as that thing can make outbound connections to the internet, then 100% Authy can be integrated into that. So thank you, good question. What else do we got here? How do you pay for Authy? Is it per user or per authentication? Actually, talking to our sales team, you might be able to pay for both. If you look at our website, we have information about buying it per authentication. And what's interesting about buying it per authentication is that we only charge you when we have a verified authentication. So for example, if you are calling the API to request people to authenticate, and only 50% of those people actually do authenticate, you're only being charged the ones that you're validating, the 50%. There's a caveat to that if your mechanism that you're using, however, is SMS or voice, obviously there's the extra cost that's passed on to you of generating that voice call and that SMS, which is why a lot of people are looking at our push notification, because push notification, you're just making a network request out to the phone, there's no extra overhead, and then you only get charged when they actually respond and you authenticate them. I do know that if you talk to our sales organization, we do have the ability to also charge per user, so we're trying to fit whatever sales model you might have. And we've got another question here about pre-integrations to cloud environments. This is from Sierra. So yes, we do have a few pre-integrations that people have requested. Typically, what we want to do is when we build an integration in-house, we're always trying to build something that's mass use. So we've had a lot of requests for protecting things like WordPress and also SSH connectivity. So people who are using command line interfaces to authenticate to other servers running either in AWS, in Azure, or something of that nature. So if you go to authie.com, you'll be able to navigate to integrations we've built for WordPress, for SSH, and I believe we also have an OpenVPN integration that we've built. Again, these are for people that have requested us to do the work. Typically, integrations with major cloud products, we're actually going to those vendors and saying, hey, you should integrate Authy into your application, because we can't modify their code. Whereas with WordPress, it has a whole plugin architecture that allows it to create that integration. Another place to go look at a lot of the open source integrations that we've done. And as I mentioned when I was asking Jensen earlier about what technology he uses, we actually develop and have open sourced a whole bunch of libraries for different platforms that significantly reduce the amount of code you have to write to integrate with Authy. So if you go to github.com/Authy, you can go take a look at some of those environments as well. And I think we've just got time for one more question that's come in here. Actually, it's another question here about pre-built integrations. So we've just hit our 40-minute limit. I apologize for that. If you have asked any questions, we'll reach out to you directly because we do have your contact details, so we'll follow up. So we've only been able to take 3 questions there. So thanks very much for everybody to join, and